Atlanta, January 1931. A cold morning. Georgia fog hangs low over the putting green, muffling sound, blurring the edges of the world. James Stark, the groundskeeper, walks his usual rounds across the sprawling estate, 42 acres of manicured perfection. That's when he notices a car parked where no car should be. At first, Stark assumes it belongs to someone from nearby Emory College. Faculty are permitted to walk the grounds. But as he approaches, a chill runs through him that has nothing to do with the winter air. Inside the vehicle sit two bodies, a young man and a young woman, both dead from gunshot wounds. The man's hand still rests near an ivory-handled pistol, a pistol that belongs to his employer. The gun belongs to Asa Candler Jr., heir to the Coca-Cola fortune, and the mansion that looms behind the morning mist, this 40-room Georgian Revival palace with its gold-leaf ceilings and 3-story music room, would never quite shake the shadow of what happened that day. But the secret isn't just the gunshot. The real story lies beneath, in the cement tunnels, in the labor records no one talks about, in the pathology of a building designed to prove something that could never be proven. To understand how death came to visit this place of dreams and excess, we must travel back further, back to a dusty pharmacy in rural Georgia, where a peculiar brown syrup would change the world and doom a family to chase a legacy they could never escape. The story of Briarcliff begins not with marble halls or gilded ballrooms, but with a small-town pharmacist and a $2,000 gamble. If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture, the kind that uncover not just blueprints but the psychology beneath them, please like and subscribe. It helps us continue this work. Asa Candler Sr. was born in Villa Rica, Georgia in 1851. The son of a merchant, raised on Methodist discipline and the belief that hard work could buy salvation. He became a pharmacist, moved to Atlanta in 1873, built a respectable business, selling patent medicines in a city still healing from Civil War wounds. Then, in 1888, something extraordinary happened. A struggling pharmacist named John Pemberton came to him with an unusual proposition. Pemberton had invented a sweet, carbonated tonic called Coca-Cola. He was dying, broke, desperate. For just $2,300, roughly $75,000 in today's money, Asa Candler Sr. purchased the formula that would make his family one of the wealthiest in America. What Candler saw in that fizzy brown liquid was more than medicine. Magic in a bottle. He threw himself into marketing with evangelical fervor. Free samples, Coca-Cola calendars, Coca-Cola clocks. By 1895, 7 years after he bought the formula, the drink was sold in every state and territory. Asa Sr. became a millionaire many times over. He built the tallest building in Atlanta, developed entire neighborhoods, donated millions to establish Emory University. In 1916, he was elected mayor. But while Asa Sr. was building an empire, his second son was building something else entirely. A reputation. Asa Candler Jr., born 1880, was everything his father was not. Where Asa Sr. was disciplined, Buddy was wild. Where his older brother Charles Howard was responsible, Buddy couldn't sit still. The family sent him away at age 8 to an all-girls school run by his aunt, which tells you how desperate they were. Nothing stuck. Not school, not church, not even the Coca-Cola bottling plants his father sent him to manage out west. And everything Buddy would build, every brick laid at Briarcliff, was an attempt to prove he mattered as much as the empire his father created from a $2,000 gamble. In 1916, that chance arrived. Asa Sr., newly elected mayor, decided to give his children their inheritances early. Each received millions. But Buddy's portion came with a catch. Family legend holds that Buddy received the smallest portion of the inheritance. His father deducted outstanding debts from his total, possibly as much as $100,000. But even the smallest share of a fortune is still a fortune. 3 years later, in 1919, the Candler children made a decision that shocked their father. They sold Coca-Cola to a consortium of investors led by Ernest Woodruff for $25 million. In today's money, roughly $400 million. Buddy suddenly found himself with more money than he could reasonably spend. Reasonable, however, was never a word anyone associated with Buddy. He turned his attention to the humble farmhouse on Briarcliff Farm. What he envisioned wasn't merely a home, a statement, a declaration that would prove to everyone, especially his more respectable older brother, that Asa Candler Jr. was somebody worth noticing. Construction began in 1920. Buddy hired architect C.E. Fraser to design a mansion that would be larger than his father's house, larger even than his brother Charles's impressive Callanwold. The design was Georgian revival, but the scale was anything but subtle. When completed in 1922, Briarcliff contained more than 40 rooms, 7 bedrooms, 10 bathrooms, multiple solariums, a grand library with hand-carved wood paneling, and a ballroom on the 3rd floor with 14-foot ceilings painted in gold leaf. The construction cost was staggering. Newspapers reported $30,000 just for the tile work alone, over $500,000 in today's money. Buddy demanded the finest materials, the most skilled craftsmen, carved marble fireplaces in every bedroom, coffered ceilings, intricate moldings, terrace gardens, 2 swimming pools, one for his family and one opened to the public, complete with a Coca-Cola stand. But luxury wasn't enough. Buddy wanted wonder. In 1925, 3 years after the main house was completed, he commissioned a massive addition. A music room that rose 3 stories high with a vaulted Tudor ceiling and walls clad in richly carved oak panels. A limestone fireplace 9 feet tall dominated one end. And at the heart of it all stood Buddy's ultimate statement. An Aeolian pipe organ so enormous it rivaled those found in cathedrals. The organ cost $94,000, over $1.5 million in today's money. It had 88 ranks and 187 stops, making it the largest privately owned organ in Georgia. Buddy's father owned an Aeolian organ. His brother Charles owned one too. But Buddy's organ was bigger than both. The room itself, called Asa's Hall, hosted concerts broadcast on radio station WSB. The press began calling Briarcliff 40 acres of fairyland. But fairylands require maintenance. And here is where the story most people don't tell. Behind the gold leaf and the concerts, an invisible machine kept Briarcliff running. Every morning, James Stark, the head groundskeeper, walked those 42 acres. His salary was $1,200 a year, roughly $24,000 in today's money. He supervised a rotating crew of at least 6 gardeners whose job was to maintain the terraced gardens, the golf course, the tennis courts. Inside the mansion, a staff of 8 worked 6 days a week. A head housekeeper earned $900 annually. 3 maids, paid $700 each, scrubbed the 40 rooms. 2 cooks prepared meals in kitchens designed for entertaining hundreds. A chauffeur maintained the fleet of automobiles. But the real labor, the work that truly defined the excess, came when Buddy decided his estate needed a zoo. He acquired animals from around the world, possibly purchasing them from a struggling European circus. 4 elephants, whom Buddy named Coca-Cola, Refreshing, and Delicious. A Bengal tiger, a black leopard, lions, bears, exotic birds, a gorilla, a baboon. Maintaining these animals required a dedicated crew. At least 4 handlers worked full-time in the menagerie. They cleaned enclosures, prepared specialized diets, monitored health. The elephants alone consumed hundreds of pounds of hay and vegetables weekly. The carnivores required fresh meat daily, shipped in from local butchers at considerable expense. During peak entertaining seasons, when Buddy threw his legendary parties, temporary staff swelled the workforce to over 20 people. Musicians, servers, valets, security. The annual operating cost of Briarcliff was estimated at $75,000, over $1.2 million in today's terms. That's just to keep it running, not counting construction or acquisitions. All of it, every manicured hedge and polished marble floor, depended on hands that never appeared in the photographs. The private menagerie became legendary. Politicians came seeking favorable coverage in newspapers Buddy knew how to influence. Celebrities came for the glamour. Writers and artists came for the spectacle. The parallels to another famous fictional host were not lost on observers. Like J. Gatsby in F. Scott Fitzgerald's novel, Buddy Candler threw lavish parties in a magnificent mansion, surrounded himself with excess, and seemed to be chasing something that always remained just out of reach. Family lore claims that Buddy's oldest surviving son once said he had lived like the great Gatsby during his young adult years at Briarcliff. The comparison feels apt. Like Gatsby, Buddy was new money trying desperately to prove itself. Like Gatsby, he built a monument to his own ambition. But the fairyland had teeth. In 1935, the baboon escaped. It made its way to a neighboring property where it encountered a woman who was, understandably, terrified. The baboon bit her, and, in a detail newspapers couldn't resist, stole her purse and devoured $60 in cash. The woman sued Buddy and won $10,000 in damages, roughly $225,000 today. The neighbors had been complaining about the noise and smell for years. After the baboon incident, Buddy was forced to close his private menagerie. He donated the animals, along with funds for their care, to Grant Park Zoo, which would later become Zoo Atlanta. James Stark, the groundskeeper, watched the elephants leave. He had cleaned their enclosures for a decade. Now he returned to maintaining gardens and golf greens, preparing the estate for what would come next. Something darker. But before that shadow fell, Buddy threw himself into a new obsession, one that would bring Jose Cruz into his life, and ultimately 2 bodies into a car on a foggy January morning. To understand what happened at Briarcliff, you need to understand the building itself, not as decoration, as diagnosis. Georgian Revival architecture is supposed to convey stability, symmetry, the orderliness of the British aristocracy. But Buddy's version of Georgian Revival tells a different story. The mansion was arranged across 3 floors with 42 rooms, distributed in a pattern that reveals more than it conceals. The first floor was performance space. The grand entrance hall, 20 feet high with a sweeping double staircase, announced arrival. Visitors entered and immediately understood. Money lives here. The formal dining room seated 24 beneath a coffered ceiling. The library, lined with hand-carved wood paneling, suggested scholarly respectability that Buddy had never actually achieved. These were the public rooms, the theater where Buddy could play the role of established gentleman. But move deeper into the floor plan and something shifts. The second floor contained the family bedrooms, each with its own marble fireplace, each isolated by thick walls and heavy doors. Buddy's master suite occupied the entire east wing. Helen's room, before her death, was separated from his by a sitting room and a private bathroom. Even in their most intimate spaces, distance. The children's rooms were clustered on the opposite side of the house, accessible only through a narrow hallway that could be closed off. Servants' stairs allowed staff to move between floors without ever appearing in the main corridors. The architecture created invisible pathways, parallel worlds within the same structure. This was an accident. This was design. The third floor is where Buddy's psychology becomes impossible to ignore. Most Georgian mansions use the top floor for servants, quarters, and storage. Buddy built his ballroom here. Gold leaf ceilings 14 feet high, windows that looked out over the entire estate. A room designed for spectacle, placed where no one would casually encounter it. You had to be invited up. You had to climb 2 flights of stairs. You had to earn access to Buddy's grandest space. And then, that music room addition in 1925. 3 stories tall, connected to the main house but structurally separate. You could enter Briarcliff and never know the music room existed unless Buddy wanted you to know. The organ itself, that $1.5 million statement, was positioned so that the organist sat with his back to any audience. The music filled the space, but the player remained apart, hidden, in control but unseen. Every choice Buddy made in this floor plan reveals the same pattern. Create distance, maintain control, prove superiority through scale, but never allow true intimacy. Build rooms where he could be the center of attention, but always with the option to retreat behind thick walls and heavy doors. The architecture wasn't a home. It was a fortress designed to look like a palace. A machine for managing the gap between who Buddy was and who he desperately needed people to believe he was. His father built the Candler Building downtown, 17 stories of practical commerce. His brother Charles built Callenwold, elegant but livable. Buddy built a monument to isolation, dressed up as a social hub. And when you walk through Briarcliff today, even in its restored form, you can feel it. The way the rooms don't quite connect naturally. The way the grand gestures, the gold leaf and the marble, never quite mask the underlying coldness of the design. This is what architecture as pathology means. The building doesn't just house the owner, it reveals him. And what did Buddy fill his carefully designed fortress with? Not just furniture and art. He filled it with performance, with magic, with illusion. Starting in 1927, a new figure entered the story, a man who would help Buddy create spectacles and who would, ultimately, bring tragedy to those carefully isolated halls. Before the zoo closed, before the shadow of darker events fell across the estate, Briarcliff was the center of Atlanta's social universe. Buddy and Helen Candler threw parties that became legend. Politicians came seeking favorable coverage in newspapers that Buddy knew how to influence. Celebrities came for the glamour. Writers and artists came for the spectacle. The parallels to another famous fictional host were not lost on observers. Like J. Gatsby in F. Scott Fitzgerald's novel, Buddy threw lavish parties in a magnificent mansion, surrounded himself with excess, and seemed to be chasing something that always remained just out of reach. Family lore claims that Buddy's oldest surviving son once said he had lived like the great Gatsby during his young adult years at Briarcliff. The comparison feels apt. Like Gatsby, Buddy was new money, trying desperately to prove itself. Like Gatsby, he built a monument to his own ambition. And like Gatsby, he would discover that all the gold leaf and champagne in the world couldn't protect him from loss. Helen Candler, the gracious hostess who had stood beside Buddy through all his schemes and dreams, died in January 1927. She was only 40 years old. The local papers praised her as a leading figure in local social and civic circles. Bishop Warren Candler, Buddy's uncle, officiated at her funeral. She was buried at Westview Cemetery, in a plot that Buddy would obsessively design and expand over the coming years. 9 months after Helen's death, Buddy remarried. His new wife was Florence Adeline Stevenson, a widow from Lithonia, Georgia, who had worked as his secretary for 9 years. The speed of the marriage raised eyebrows in Atlanta society, but Buddy seemed unconcerned with public opinion. He never had been. Then came October 1929. The stock market collapsed. Banks failed. Fortunes evaporated overnight. America descended into the Great Depression. And here is where the moral calculus of Briarcliff becomes impossible to ignore. While Buddy sipped champagne behind his mansion's thick walls, outside those gates, Atlanta was starving. The same craftsmen who had laid his $500,000 tile work were now standing in bread lines. The gardeners he had once employed at $1,200 a year were desperate for any work. Families who had built the marble fireplaces in his 40 rooms were losing their own homes. In 1932, at the depth of the Depression, a quarter of Atlanta's workforce was unemployed. Soup kitchens stretched around city blocks. Men who had once taken pride in their work as masons, carpenters, and laborers now stood with their heads down, waiting for a bowl of soup and a piece of bread. At Briarcliff, the parties continued. Buddy had insulated himself with the Coca-Cola fortune. While others sold everything they owned just to eat, he filled his third-floor ballroom with new obsessions. He turned his grief and his wealth toward illusion, toward magic, toward anything that might distract from the reality beyond his gates. He had always been drawn to things that defied explanation. Now, in the late 1920s and early 1930s, that interest became all-consuming. He began collecting magical apparatus with the same fervor he had once devoted to racing cars and exotic animals. He accumulated what was reportedly the largest private collection of magic equipment in the world at the time. Trick boxes, disappearing cabinets, elaborate stage props filled the third-floor ballroom. And then Buddy met a young man who would bring his passion for illusion to a tragic end. During a trip to the Philippines, Buddy encountered a talented magician named Jose Cruz. The young performer was skilled, charismatic, and hungry for opportunity. Buddy was enchanted. He invited Jose to return with him to Atlanta to live at Briarcliff and serve as his personal magic tutor and butler. Jose accepted. In April 1925, the 24-year-old Filipino magician arrived in San Francisco aboard the SS President Taft, along with his younger brother Philemon and another companion. They traveled directly to Atlanta and moved into an apartment above the garage at Briarcliff. For the next several years, Jose became an integral part of life at the mansion. He taught Buddy new tricks. He helped organize legendary magic parties. He assisted with elaborate shows that Buddy hosted for Atlanta's elite. The third-floor ballroom was transformed into a theater, complete with a secret door likely used for disappearing acts. Buddy flew famous magicians into town on his private airplane, including Harry Blackstone, one of the most celebrated performers of the era. Buddy even claimed to have been friends with Harry Houdini himself, though records are unclear whether Houdini ever actually visited Briarcliff. What is known is that Houdini maintained his headquarters in the Candler Building in New York City, which Buddy helped manage. These magic soirees became the talk of Atlanta. High society gathered in Buddy's ballroom to watch illusions performed against walls of gold leaf, their champagne glasses catching the light as impossible things seemed to happen before their eyes. For a few years, Briarcliff was a place where reality itself seemed negotiable, where a wealthy man's whims could conjure elephants and make objects vanish into thin air. But Jose Cruz carried secrets of his own. In the months leading up to that cold January morning in 1931, Jose had begun seeing a young woman named Gladys Fricks, and that relationship would bring death back to the putting green where James Stark walked his rounds. In the months leading up to that cold January morning in 1931, Jose had begun seeing a young woman named Gladys Fricks. She was a local girl. Their relationship troubled her family. Some accounts suggest they disapproved of Jose's background, others hint at darker concerns. But Gladys's friends later testified that she seemed happy with Jose, that she had sought out his company, and that on the night of January 17th, she had gone out with him willingly. What happened in the hours that followed remains the subject of speculation. The couple went out that Saturday evening, apparently enjoying each other's company. At some point during the night, they drove to the southern edge of the Briarcliff Estate, near the putting green, where Buddy liked to practice his golf swing. There, in the quiet darkness of that sprawling property, something terrible unfolded. When James Stark found the car the next morning, Jose Cruz was slumped in the driver's seat with a gunshot wound to his temple. Gladys Fricks lay in his lap, dead from a gunshot wound to the abdomen. A note was found in the vehicle suggesting that their deaths were a double suicide born of thwarted love. But investigators quickly noticed troubling details. The note appeared to be written by a woman, but the handwriting matched Jose's. Only one empty cartridge was found on the floor of the car, yet 2 people were dead. And the gun, that ivory-handled pistol, belonged to Asa Candler Jr. A coroner's jury was convened that very afternoon. After reviewing the evidence, they reached a verdict that contradicted the suicide note. Jose Cruz, they determined, had murdered Gladys Fricks and then killed himself. She had trusted him. She had gone with him willingly, and he had betrayed that trust in the most final way possible. The murder weapon was displayed by the undertaker. Reporters photographed the ivory-handled pistol and the pearl-handled dagger that had also been found in the car. The story made headlines across Atlanta. Suddenly, Briarcliff was famous for something other than parties and elephants. Buddy was not implicated in the deaths. There was no evidence that he knew Jose had taken his gun. Investigators found nothing to suggest any involvement beyond the unhappy coincidence of ownership. But the scandal tainted everything. The magic parties stopped. The ballroom fell silent. Buddy, who had already begun drinking more heavily in the years since Helen's death, seemed to retreat further into himself. And the mansion that had been built for joy began its long, slow descent into shadow. The 1930s arrived like a cold wind through the Georgia pines. The stock market had crashed in October 1929, and even families as wealthy as the Candlers felt the chill. Buddy's father had died that same year, leaving behind a complicated legacy. The golden age of excess was ending, and Briarcliff's master was beginning to falter. Buddy's drinking became harder to hide. Friends noticed the tremor in his hands. Florence, his second wife, tried to manage both her husband and the estate, but the task was overwhelming. The zoo animals were gone now, donated to Grant Park after the baboon scandal. The magic equipment gathered dust in the ballroom. What kept Buddy going, strangely enough, was death. For more than 20 years he had been involved in running Westview Cemetery in Atlanta. He threw himself into this work with characteristic obsessiveness. He oversaw the construction of one of the largest community mausoleums in the world. He designed elaborate monuments and planned garden pathways with the same attention to detail he had once devoted to Briarcliff's grounds. His own mausoleum at Westview became an obsession. For years, he refined its design, planning the landscaping down to the smallest shrub. The man who had spent his life chasing novelty was now preparing for his final exit. By the late 1930s, Buddy made a surprising decision. He stopped drinking. Whatever the reason, the man everyone assumed would drink himself to death in his gilded mansion put down the bottle and stayed sober for the rest of his life. But sobriety couldn't save Briarcliff. The fortune that had seemed endless in 1919 was nearly exhausted. The mansion required constant maintenance, and Buddy's ventures had produced more failures than successes. The costs of running a 42-acre estate were astronomical. By the end of the 1930s, the writing was on the wall. The fairy-tale castle was becoming an albatross. Its grand rooms echoed with the footsteps of a diminished staff. Its gardens grew wilder. The famous swimming pools still sparkled in the Georgia sun, but the crowds of glamorous guests had drifted away. The man who had once commanded elephants and conjured illusions was running out of tricks. The 1940s brought war to America, and with it a final reckoning for Asa Candler Jr. and his fairy-tale estate. While young men shipped off to fight in Europe and the Pacific, the aging heir to the Coca-Cola fortune watched his world crumble around him. The parties had stopped years ago. The magic shows were a distant memory. The elephants and lions had long since found new homes at Grant Park Zoo. What remained was a 42-acre estate that devoured money faster than Buddy could earn it, and a mansion whose grandeur now felt more like mockery than triumph. By 1948, the inevitable could no longer be avoided. Asa Candler Jr., the man who had once thrown the most lavish parties in Atlanta, who had owned the largest private organ in Georgia, who had kept elephants named after his father's soft drink, was forced to sell Briarcliff. The buyer was the General Services Administration, a branch of the federal government. The plan was to convert the estate into a veterans hospital, a place where soldiers returning from World War II could receive medical care. It seemed fitting in a way. The house built for excess would now serve those who had sacrificed everything. Buddy reportedly received far less than the mansion was worth, a final indignity for a man who had always struggled with money. But the Veterans Hospital never materialized. The plans stalled. Budgets shifted. Briarcliff sat empty, its grand rooms gathering dust while bureaucrats debated its fate. Meanwhile, Buddy and Florence moved out of the mansion they had called home for more than 2 decades. They relocated to the top floor of the Briarcliff Hotel, a building that Buddy himself had developed back in 1924, located at the corner of Ponce de Leon Avenue and North Highland Avenue in Atlanta's Virginia Highland neighborhood. It was a comfortable penthouse, but it was not Briarcliff. It was not the castle on the hill. From the penthouse windows, on clear days, Buddy could see across the city. He couldn't see Briarcliff itself. The trees and distance obscured it, but he knew exactly where it stood. The Georgian Revival Palace, with the 3-story music room. The 40 rooms he had filled with marble and gold leaf. The gardens where elephants once walked. And he knew what was happening to it. Empty. Abandoned. The paint beginning to peel. The fountains dry. The careful isolation he had designed into every floor plan now serving no purpose except to trap dust and silence. For 5 years, Buddy lived in that penthouse, surrounded by memories and the knowledge of what he had lost. He was sober now, clear-headed, which meant he could see everything with terrible clarity. The castle he had built to prove himself had become the prison he couldn't escape, even after leaving. He had wanted to be bigger than his father. Bigger than his brother. He had built a monument to that need, and the monument had consumed him. Not all at once, but slowly. A bankruptcy here, a scandal there. The steady erosion of fortune and reputation until nothing remained but an old man in a hotel room, staring at a city that had moved on without him. The building hadn't made him important. It had made him isolated. The organ bigger than his father's hadn't proven anything. It had just been louder. In his final years, Buddy continued his work at Westview Cemetery, overseeing the grounds and refining the design of his own mausoleum. He had spent years planning that final resting place, and now, as his health declined, he could see the end approaching. The man who had always been in motion, always chasing the next grand scheme, was finally slowing down. On January 11, 1953, Asa Candler Jr. died of liver cancer. He was 72 years old. The newspapers that had once chronicled his escapades, his elephants, his magic shows, and his scandals, now printed brief obituaries. A family friend was quoted saying that Buddy didn't do anything small. It was perhaps the truest thing anyone ever said about him. He was a man of grand gestures, of impossible dreams, of spectacular failures and occasional triumphs. He was buried at Westview Cemetery in the elaborate mausoleum he had designed himself, not far from where his first wife, Helen, had been laid to rest more than 25 years earlier. But if Buddy Candler thought his story ended with his death, he was mistaken. The mansion he built would live on, transformed in ways he never could have imagined. In 1953, the same year Buddy died, Briarcliff found its next purpose. The estate became the Georgian Clinic, the first alcohol rehabilitation facility in the state of Georgia. The irony was almost too perfect. The mansion built by a man who had struggled with drinking for much of his adult life was now dedicated to helping others overcome addiction. The grand rooms where champagne had once flowed freely were converted into treatment spaces. The terrace gardens where society ladies had strolled became grounds for patients taking their first sober steps. The Georgian Clinic operated at Briarcliff for several years. During this time, the swimming pools remained open. Patients were allowed to use them as part of their therapy, swimming laps in the same waters where movie stars and politicians had once splashed during Buddy's legendary parties. But by the late 1950s, budget constraints forced the closure of the pools. They were drained, covered, and eventually forgotten, becoming just another remnant of the estate's gilded past. The addiction center continued operating, eventually becoming known as the DeKalb County Addiction Center. But in 1965, Briarcliff underwent its most dramatic transformation yet. The state of Georgia decided to build the Georgia Mental Health Institute on the property. and what they constructed would change the character of the estate forever. A massive multi-story tower rose on the grounds, a stark modernist structure that looked nothing like Buddy's Georgian Revival mansion. The tower was surrounded by a series of smaller buildings, cottages arranged in a semicircular pattern around the main facility. These cottages housed patients, and they were connected to the central hospital by something that would fuel decades of dark legends. Underground tunnels. The tunnels were practical in design, built to solve a simple problem. Georgia winters, though mild, still brought rain and cold. Transporting psychiatric patients between buildings in bad weather posed risks. So the state engineering department designed a network of underground passages. The construction was utilitarian. Poured concrete walls, 8 feet high, reinforced ceilings to support the weight of the grounds above. Fluorescent light fixtures every 20 feet, though half of them seemed perpetually burned out. The floors were smooth concrete, sloped slightly for drainage because the tunnels sat below the water table, and moisture was constant. The main tunnel ran for 300 feet from the central tower to the farthest cottage. Side passages branched off at right angles, connecting to other buildings. The total network stretched nearly half a mile underground. Ventilation was minimal. 2 fans at either end of the main passage pushed air through, but it was never enough. The tunnels always smelled of dampness and disinfectant, a combination that clung to clothing and hair. The walls wept. That's what the staff called it. Condensation formed on the cold concrete and ran down in constant streams, pooling in the corners where the floor met the walls. In winter, these puddles sometimes froze. In summer, they bred mold that maintenance crews fought a losing battle against. Every tunnel door was steel, painted institutional green, with a small wire-reinforced window at eye level. The locks were heavy industrial deadbolts. Some doors required 2 keys. Others had keypads, though the technology was primitive by today's standards. The tunnels allowed staff to transport patients between buildings regardless of weather, and they provided a secure pathway that kept the mentally ill away from public view. But practical or not, those tunnels captured the imagination of everyone who heard about them. Dark passages beneath a crumbling mansion, connecting buildings full of troubled souls. Staff members who worked the night shift spoke of strange sounds echoing through those passages, footsteps that seemed to follow them, doors that opened on their own. For 32 years, from 1965 to 1997, the Georgia Mental Health Institute operated on the grounds of Briarcliff. During this time, the original mansion was incorporated into the facility, its elegant rooms subdivided and repurposed for institutional use. Walls were erected where none had existed before. Drop ceilings hid the ornate plasterwork above. Linoleum covered the hardwood floors. The transformation was thorough and heartbreaking to anyone who remembered what the mansion had once been. The music room, with its soaring 3-story ceiling and magnificent pipe organ, became Asa's Hall, used for various therapeutic and administrative purposes. The organ itself was eventually removed. Some accounts say it was gifted to Wesleyan College in Macon, Georgia. Others suggest it was sold. Either way, by the time the hospital closed, only the console remained, a ghostly reminder of the symphonies that had once filled the room. The ballroom on the 3rd floor, where Buddy had hosted his magic soirees and stored his collection of illusion apparatus, was converted into dormitories for nurses. The secret door that had once been used for disappearing acts was walled over or forgotten. The carved marble fireplaces gathered dust. The gold leaf walls faded and chipped. Layer by layer, the grandeur of Briarcliff was buried beneath institutional paint and fluorescent lighting. And then there were the patients. Thousands of people passed through the Georgia Mental Health Institute during its 3 decades of operation. Some were there voluntarily, seeking help for depression or anxiety. Others were committed against their will, locked away in rooms that had once hosted champagne toasts. The tunnels that connected the buildings saw countless footsteps, countless stories of suffering and recovery, breakdown, and healing. Nurses worked long shifts in rooms where socialites had once danced. Doctors held consultations in spaces designed for dinner parties. The contrast between what the mansion had been and what it had become could not have been more stark. The institution treated patients with the methods of its era, some helpful, others now considered barbaric. Electroshock therapy was administered in rooms with carved marble fireplaces. Group therapy sessions were held in the solarium where Buddy's exotic plants had once flourished. The mansion absorbed all of it, its walls becoming repositories for decades of human pain and hope. When the hospital finally closed in 1997, it left behind more than empty buildings. It left behind stories. Rumors began to circulate almost immediately. People whispered about strange sounds coming from the abandoned mansion, about lights flickering in windows that should have been dark, about figures seen walking the grounds at night. The tunnels, now sealed and forbidden, became the subject of particular fascination. What had happened down there in those concrete passages? But Briarcliff's story wasn't over yet. The abandoned hospital would soon attract attention from an unexpected source, and in doing so would introduce the mansion to a whole new generation who had never heard of Buddy Candler or his elephants. One story that emerged involved a former nurse who was spotted wandering the property years after the hospital closed. A local preservation advocate named Charlie Payne encountered her one day walking across the grounds as if searching for something she had lost. She kept saying that she had been a nurse at the hospital. Payne later recalled looking at her hands as she spoke and seeing blood where she had scratched and picked at her skin. Whatever had happened at the hospital, he realized, had taken a toll on her that never healed. Graffiti began appearing inside the abandoned buildings. Trespassers, drawn by the mansion's growing reputation as a haunted house, broke in to explore and left their marks. One piece of graffiti scrolled on an indoor fountain in the former solarium read simply, "It ran with blood." Whether this was a prank by local teenagers or something more sinister, no one could say, but it added to the mythology that was growing around Briarcliff like ivy on its crumbling walls. In 1998, Emory University purchased the property from the government. The university already had deep connections to the Candler family. Asa Candler Jr. had been one of Emory's greatest benefactors, donating millions of dollars and 75 acres of land to help establish the university in Atlanta. Now, decades later, his grandson's mansion had come full circle, returning to the institution that bore so much of the family's legacy. But Emory didn't know quite what to do with Briarcliff. The mansion was in terrible condition, its roof leaking, its walls damaged by decades of water infiltration. Mold crept through the rooms. The cost of restoration was estimated in the millions, money that Emory was reluctant to spend on a building with no clear purpose. So the university did what many owners of historic properties do when faced with impossible choices. They practiced what might be called benevolent neglect. They kept the building standing, chased away vandals, maintained basic security, and waited for a better solution to present itself. Meanwhile, Hollywood discovered Briarcliff. The abandoned mental hospital tower, with its stark modernist architecture and undeniable creepiness, caught the attention of location scouts. In 2016, the Netflix series Stranger Things filmed scenes at the facility, using it as the exterior of Hawkins National Laboratory, the sinister government facility at the heart of the show's supernatural mysteries. Suddenly, fans from around the world were making pilgrimages to Briarcliff, hoping to glimpse the building they had seen on screen. But most of these visitors never noticed the mansion itself, hidden behind overgrown trees just a short distance from the famous tower. They came for the hospital, for the Stranger Things connection, never realizing that the real story lay in the crumbling Georgian revival mansion, where elephants had once roamed and magicians had performed impossible feats. The show's success brought international attention to the property, but it was attention focused on the wrong building. The modernist tower was interesting, certainly, but it held none of the romance or tragedy of Buddy's original creation. The mansion continued to decay. Paint peeled from walls that had once been covered in silk. Chandeliers that had illuminated society balls now hung dark and dusty. The greenhouses where Buddy had cultivated exotic plants from around the world stood with their glass panes shattered, their iron frames rusting in the Georgia humidity. The carriage house where Jose Cruz had lived, where he had plotted whatever darkness led him to that terrible morning in 1931, still stood behind the main building, weathered but intact. Preservation advocates grew increasingly alarmed. Charlie Payne, who lived across the street from the property, began a campaign to save Briarcliff. He argued that the mansion was more than just a building. It was a piece of Atlanta's history, a window into the Gilded Age excess that had shaped the city. The mansion had been listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1988, which provided some protection but no funding for restoration. Without significant investment, Payne warned Briarcliff would be lost forever. Sarah Butler, a writer and urban explorer, became fascinated by the mansion after visiting it with a friend in 2015. What started as curiosity became obsession. She began researching Buddy Candler's life, digging through archives and newspaper clippings, piecing together the story of a man who had been largely forgotten. She discovered the murder of Jose Cruz and Gladys Fricks, a story that had been buried for decades. She tracked down the locations of the former zoo, finding the foundations where elephant cages had once stood. She started an Instagram account and a website dedicated to preserving Briarcliff's history. Her research eventually became a book, Fortune and Folly: The Weird and Wonderful Life of the South's Most Eccentric Millionaire. In it, she argued that Buddy Candler was far more than the eccentric alcoholic that history had dismissed him as. He was a complicated man, brilliant and troubled, visionary and reckless. His legacy extended far beyond Briarcliff. The airport that bears his family's name exists because of land he developed. Zoo Atlanta houses descendants of animals he donated. The hotels he built still stand. Yet somehow his story had been lost, tangled up or overshadowed by his more respectable father. Then in 2022, hope finally arrived for Briarcliff. Emory University announced that it had brokered a long-term ground lease with Gallery Living, a developer specializing in senior living communities. The plan was ambitious. Gallery would build a luxury retirement community on the Briarcliff property, and in exchange they would restore the original mansion to its former glory. The restored mansion would be used as an event space, open to the public for the first time in decades. Kelly Panter, Vice President of Construction for Gallery Living, explained the company's interest simply. "We love the historic nature of the property," she said. The DeKalb County Planning Commission and surrounding neighborhood associations approved the initial plans, and renovations began. For the first time in nearly a century, craftsmen were working to restore Briarcliff rather than subdivide or neglect it. The leaking roof would be repaired. The water-damaged walls would be restored. The hand-carved wood paneling, the marble fireplaces, the coffered ceilings, all would be brought back to something approaching their original splendor. The music room, Asa's Hall, would once again host gatherings, though the magnificent organ was gone forever. Before Emory handed over the keys, they allowed a group of journalists and historians to tour the property one final time. Sarah Butler served as guide, wearing a hot pink respirator mask, as she led visitors through narrow hallways cluttered with debris. An elegant brass chandelier lay on the floor, knocked from its mount years ago. Mold covered many surfaces. The air was thick with dust and decay. Yet beneath it all, the bones of Buddy's dream remained visible. The carved stone, the arched doorways, the proportions that spoke of ambition and imagination. Walking through those ruined rooms, visitors could almost see the ghosts of parties past. They could imagine the music room filled with the thunderous notes of that massive pipe organ. They could picture the elephants wandering the back property, their presence announced by the names that would make anyone smile. Coca-Cola, refreshing and delicious. They could envision Jose Cruz performing magic tricks in the Gold Leaf Ballroom, not knowing that within a few years he would make headlines for the worst possible reason. The story of Briarcliff is, in many ways, a story about what money can and cannot buy. And now we arrive at the final chapter, where all those layers of history, all that gold leaf and grief, converge into a single lesson about ambition, legacy, and the strange persistence of stone. The story of Briarcliff is, in many ways, a story about what money can and cannot buy. Asa Candler Jr. proved that money could build an empire from a $2,300 formula. His son, Buddy, proved that money could build a palace, fill it with wonders, and throw parties that dazzled a generation. But neither man could use money to purchase happiness or escape tragedy. Helen died young. Buddy's first son died in infancy. Jose Cruz killed a young woman and himself on the grounds of the estate. The mansion that was supposed to prove Buddy's worth to the world became a psychiatric hospital, then a ruin, then a curiosity for urban explorers and television location scouts. Yet something about Briarcliff endures. The walls still stand. The stories still circulate. The ghosts, whether real or imagined, still walk the grounds in the minds of those who hear about the place. And now, after decades of neglect, the mansion is being restored, given a second chance that Buddy himself never received. Perhaps that is the true legacy of Briarcliff. Not the parties or the scandals, not the elephants or the murder, but the simple fact that a building can outlast its builder, can accumulate new meanings and new stories long after its original purpose has been forgotten. Buddy Candler wanted to be remembered. He wanted to prove that he was more than his father's troubled son, more than his older brother's irresponsible sibling. He built a palace to announce to the world that he mattered. And in the end, the palace outlived them all. It survived Buddy's death, survived decades as a mental institution, survived years of abandonment and decay. It will soon welcome a new generation of residents, seniors, who will live out their final years in the shadow of a mansion built by a man who spent his final years planning his own tomb. The circle closes, the story continues, and somewhere in the restored music room, where the organ once thundered and magicians once performed impossible feats, you might swear you can still hear an echo of laughter from those long-ago parties, when Atlanta's own great Gatsby threw open his doors and invited the world to witness his dreams. Briarcliff stands today as a monument to ambition and excess, to tragedy and resilience, to the strange ways that history transforms our grandest gestures into something we never intended. The man who built it has been dead for more than 70 years. The woman he loved first lies in a cemetery he helped design. The magician who lived above his garage is buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in Atlanta. His story nearly lost to time. But the mansion remains. Its towers still rise above the Georgia trees. Its walls still hold secrets. And its future, for the first time in decades, looks bright. That is the dark story of Coca-Cola heir Asa Candler's Briarcliff Estate. A tale of fortune and folly, of elephants and organs, of murder and magic, of decay and restoration. A reminder that the houses we build become monuments not just to our dreams, but to everything that happens within their walls, long after we are gone. The fairy tale castle on the hill has weathered nearly a century of storms. It has seen glory and scandal, grandeur and ruin. It has been a home, a hospital, a haunted house, and now, finally, it is being reborn. Buddy Candler, the man who dreamed it into existence, lies in his carefully designed mausoleum at Westview Cemetery, perhaps finally at peace, and his mansion, his 40 acres of fairyland, prepares to write its next chapter. Some stories don't have endings. They simply pause, waiting for the next dreamer to come along and add their chapter to the tale. Briarcliff's story began with a restless son, trying to prove himself worthy of his father's name. It continued through decades of transformation and neglect. And now, as workers restore its faded grandeur, it enters a new era that Buddy himself could never have imagined. The elephants are gone. The organ is silent. The magic shows are over. But the walls still stand. And within them, the echoes of everything that happened here continue to resonate. That is the power of a place like Briarcliff. It holds its stories close, releasing them slowly to those patient enough to listen. And if you ever find yourself in Atlanta, driving along the road that still bears the mansion's name, look up toward the hill where those Georgian Revival towers rise above the trees. Think of the pharmacist's son, who built an empire of dreams there. Think of the elephants named for a soft drink. Think of the magician and the murder, the parties and the patience, the decades of glory and the decades of decay. Think of all the stories that a single building can hold, and know that Briarcliff, after all these years, is still standing, still waiting, still ready to reveal its secrets to anyone brave enough to step through its doors and listen to what the walls have to say. That is the legacy of Asa Candler Jr., not the speedway that became an airport, not the real estate deals that shaped Atlanta, but this mansion, this impossible dream made real in stone and wood and gold leaf, which refused to die even when everyone had forgotten why it was built in the first place. Briarcliff endures,